Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Darya Dolzikova, who is a research fellow with Royal United Service Institute, Russia's Proliferation and Nuclear Policy program. She analyzes the role of Russia in the global nuclear supply chain and how Russia influences nuclear security, especially in regards to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Welcome, Darya.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you that you have found time. You are researching Russia's role in the global nuclear supply chain, and Rosatom is quite a name there, state-owned nuclear corporation of Russia. What is Rosatom's role in supporting of Russia's invasion in Ukraine? You research Zaporizhzhia power plant, which is being operated by Rosatom now.
Sure. So precisely as you point out, Rosatom is a state-owned enterprise. As a result, it's very intimately connected to really the senior echelons of the Russian government. So if you look at the company's supervisory board, it includes individuals that are quite high-ranking in Russian government, including individuals that serve as assistants to the Russian president. There's a member of the FSB leadership there as well. The chair of the supervisory board is Sergej Kiriyenko, who was very briefly prime minister of Russia and is currently first deputy chief of staff to the presidential executive office. And Kiriyenko has also admitted to orchestrating Russia's annexation of Ukraine's occupied territories in the east. So the company is very much connected, like I said, to the upper echelons of Russian power. One of the subsidiaries of Rosatom is also operating the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in eastern Ukraine that Russia has occupied really since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. And that power plant is on the front line of the war. It's, as I mentioned, has been occupied by Russia. There's been severe concerns over the safety of the plant and whether it's being operated safely. There's concerns over the well-being of the staff. Ukrainian staff who had refused to sign contracts with this subsidiary have since reportedly been asked to leave employment at the facility. So it really is quite a dire situation at this plant that, as I said, is currently being managed by a subsidiary of Rosatom.
Zaporizhzhia power plant is not the only one which Russia has hijacked in Ukraine for a temporary time in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. There was the case of Chernobyl power plant, which was switched off, but still was related to the nuclear safety issues. What was the case there? What was the role of Rosatom in Chernobyl?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Chernobyl was occupied at the very start of the invasion. So the Russian military, when they came over from across the Belarusian border into Ukraine, they'd occupied the exclusion zone where there's that reactor that is still there after the 1986. Sorry, let me start that again. It's on a random tangent. So precisely as you said, the Russian military for a relatively brief period of time occupied the Chernobyl exclusion zone as well. So on the morning of the invasion, the Russian military had crossed over from Belarus into Ukraine. They occupied the exclusion zone, which is again in northern Ukraine near the Belarusian border. There were reports as well that Rosatom personnel were on site at Chernobyl while it was occupied by the Russian military. The Russian military departed the facility at I believe it was at the end of March 2022. So that's back in Ukrainian hands.
And despite all these facts, despite that the employees of Rosatom have participated in the occupation of Ukraine, in both cases, Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia power plant, Rosatom is a well-known and influential global player. So what countries are dependent on Rosatom services and what industry stages depend on Russia and Russia's technology most worldwide?
So yeah, Rosatom and Russia really play a very important role in global nuclear supply chains. It's a huge player with its many subsidiaries across really the nuclear fuel supply chain. So the dependencies, like I said, run across the supply chain. Primarily the dependencies in Western countries, in Europe, in the US, to a certain extent, in some Asian countries, are on Russian enrichment and conversion services. So for those who might not be familiar with the nuclear fuel cycle, essentially once you mine the uranium ore, it needs to get converted into a form that can then be used inside a nuclear reactor to generate nuclear energy. So to do that, it needs to get converted into usually a gas, and then that is then enriched to a slightly higher level of certain uranium isotopes than you would find in natural uranium. And that's quite a complicated process. And Russia plays a really important role in providing those services, so the conversion and the enrichment component for Western utilities. In addition to that, Russia is also a major exporter of nuclear power plant technology and nuclear fuel. So the actual nuclear rods, the assemblies, once they're actually assembled, and are there then delivered to those power plants to power them. So Russia plays quite an important role in that as well. Traditionally, Russian nuclear power plants have been constructed kind of in Eastern Central Europe. And increasingly, we're seeing the construction of power plants by Russia in the global south as well. So there's a couple of countries that have Russia constructing power plants there now. So Turkey, Bangladesh, India, just to name a few. And then Russia has also, like I said, historically supplied fuel to the power plants that it has built. So Ukraine was one of the biggest customers because it hosts a number of Soviet-built power plants that were then fueled by nuclear fuel that was supplied from Russia. Ukraine has since moved away, obviously, from Russian fuel supply, and those power plants are now powered by fuel that's supplied from Western suppliers.
And we're talking to Darya Dolzikova, who is a research fellow with Royal United Services Institute RUSI Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Policy program, and she analyzes the role of Russia in a global nuclear supply chain and also the role of Russia and Rosatom, Russia's state-owned nuclear agency, in regards of Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will not miss interviews like this. And Daria, you've already mentioned the special role which Russia gained in certain regions in the world because of historical ties and historical advantages. But if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, there are only 4 commercial enrichment companies worldwide, and Rosatom is one of them. So how does the competition on this market looks like, and what does Rosatom do to get access to new markets, and is it possible to compete with Rosatom on all of them?
It is quite a limited industry, I guess, in terms of the number of suppliers that actually provide enrichment services globally. And Russia, as we've been saying, is a major player among those suppliers. Now, the reason why the industry is as limited as it is because the technology that's required to convert to enrich uranium is quite complicated. It takes time and resources to set up those facilities. There's also there could be proliferation concerns and proliferation implications when it comes to nuclear weapons proliferation. So the technology that's used for enrichment of uranium and the materials that are used, that could potentially be diverted to nuclear weapons use as well. So, we don't really want a lot of these facilities in a lot of countries around. So it is actually good to have it concentrated in a certain number of countries, because again, it reduces the proliferation risk somewhat. So that's kind of why the industry is partially why the industry is the way that it is. Also, there are these big players that have taken up large parts of the market, and Russia has historically taken up a very large part of the enrichment market in particular. So I think in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, the World Nuclear Association had estimated that Russia provided 44% of global capacity worldwide when it comes to enrichment services. So that's quite a large chunk. And why Russia is such an important player? Like I said, there's a limited number of players, and Russia has been providing enrichment services for quite some time. So it builds these relationships historically, and once those relationships are built up, a lot of times it hasn't really been necessary to find additional suppliers. In the case of the US in particular, there has historically also been a very important reliance on Russian enrichment services. And that in part is a legacy of this initiative that was called Megatons to Megawatts, which saw Russian highly enriched uranium that came out of Russian nuclear weapons that was then chemically processed and converted and was delivered for U.S. energy production as low enriched uranium. So there was a lot of low enriched uranium supply from Russia to the U.S. historically. So there wasn't really a need necessarily for U.S. domestic suppliers. Now that we're trying to move away from Russian supply in the West, we're running into some issues in terms of, can we get sufficient domestic or friendly supply to replace this supply that has historically been received from Russia?
Have there any changes taken place in this role of Russia in enriched uranium supply chain since 2022, since the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine?
Yeah, so we're seeing some interesting trends starting to emerge that are probably worth noting. Russia is still an important enrichment supplier globally, but there are a couple of shifts that I've observed in looking at some of the trade data of countries' imports of enriched uranium from Russia. So one of the interesting things that has emerged is an increase in the last 2 years, so I guess from 2022, 2023, in imports of enriched uranium from Russia into China. So there's been quite a considerable and notable increase of imports into China. So in 2020, China had imported 44 tons of enriched uranium from Russia. In 2021, it hadn't imported any enriched uranium from Russia, at least according to the trade data that's been made available by the Chinese government. But then we see in 2022 the import from Russia of 685 tons of enriched uranium into China. So that's quite a considerable jump. In 2023, the value was a little bit lower, just under 500 tons, but still quite considerable. So it raises some questions around why all of a sudden there's this increase of imports into China. China has quite significant domestic demand. So it operates 55 nuclear reactors. It has another 22 under construction last time I checked. So it's quite a significant customer of nuclear fuel enriched uranium. However, China also enriches domestically. So again, there's this question around why all of a sudden all this increase of imports into China. There's a few different explanations possible. As I said, domestic demand potentially. But another thing that I've observed in my research is that there's been an increase in Chinese exports of enriched uranium to the US. Now, China appears to be interested in playing a larger role on global markets when it comes to enriched uranium sales. So, one hypothesis is that China could be importing additional Russian materials so that it could export more of its own. As more and more countries might turn away from Russia and might be looking for alternative supplies, they might turn to the Chinese, and these additional imports could could facilitate additional exports from China. I don't know, it's a hypothesis. It's really hard to know this for sure unless you actually see the contractual details. But it is one thing that I'm certainly going to be keeping an eye on, and I know others are as well. There's some shifts, or there appear to be some shifts in European imports of Russian enriched uranium as well. So we've seen a complete stop of imports of Russian enriched uranium into Sweden, for example. Sweden hosts quite an important nuclear fuel production facility. So a number of countries use that facility to make nuclear fuel for their power plants. So Russian enriched uranium, could have been delivered to that facility previously, but it certainly isn't now. So that's quite interesting. A few other countries have cut down on Russian imports as well. What we do observe, though, is again a notable jump in imports into France of Russian enriched uranium since the start of 2022. And again, there's multiple explanations that are possible for that. France as well is a major nuclear player in the sense that it hosts quite a few nuclear power plants, so it consumes nuclear fuel itself, but also it hosts a nuclear fuel production facility. So it produces fuel for other countries. So imports into France aren't necessarily for French consumption. They could be for consumption by other countries that use a French fuel manufacturing facility. But it is quite interesting that there is an increase in imports into France since 2022, and that raises questions for me on how effective unilateral bans or decisions to diversify away from Russia might be if there are still countries that are manufacturing fuel that are willing to take in Russian material. Could material that's no longer welcome elsewhere be imported into countries like France, for instance, that appear to still be willing to take that material?
And that is exactly what we observe in Rosatom strategy. Like Rosatom strategy 2030 has not been changed. They have not revised it. It was approved in 2020 before the full-scale invasion, and it is still an acting strategy. They haven't adopted it to the post-full-scale invasion situation. So that means that they do not feel to be concerned about sanctions or other limitations.
Well, I think yeah, they're probably confident in their ability to adapt to any restrictions that come in. I think that's certainly part of it. I think part of it is also that they might be confident that countries might not be willing to impose restrictions and bans because there is a certain level of dependence on Russian supply. That dependence is now decreasing somewhat, I would argue, because it's been a few years now that we're talking about diversifying away from Russia. So there's additional inventories that are being built up. There's additional capacity that's being brought online by other enrichment service providers. So that dependency certainly is decreasing, but I wouldn't say that it's gone entirely. And I think Russia is aware of that, and perhaps they're betting on the fact that enough countries won't bring in restrictions that they'll still be able to generate that revenue. And of course, they're going to be exploring new markets as well, not just in terms of enrichment and where they sell their enrichment services, but in the sale of other materials and technologies, namely the export of nuclear power plant technology, the construction of nuclear power plants, the export of nuclear fuel. We've seen an apparent shift in interest towards the global south, even before the start of the full-scale invasion. And I expect that will probably continue in the coming years.
What countries, if you have mentioned these new markets, what countries would come as first into consideration for Rosatom to expand their activities?
There's a push globally to move to more environmentally friendly sources of energy. So there's a growing global interest in nuclear power. And I'm sure that Russia will be looking to take advantage of that to sell its nuclear reactor technology abroad. I've already mentioned Russia's constructing nuclear power plants in a number of countries. That includes Turkey, Bangladesh, a few others. Where Russia might turn to next, it's hard to say. We have seen Russia sign MOUs with Burkina Faso and Mali on nuclear energy cooperation. Whether that actually leads to anything in the long term is hard to say. It might just be an MOU for now that doesn't actually come to any kind of fruition in terms of constructing any kind of nuclear power plants or anything else. But it does show a certain interest from Russia to at least start exploring new markets, I would think.
And can they turn to the green energy systems, which we observe in the European Union and in many other countries? Can this be a tool to reduce influence of Rosatom, or is it not enough to really compete with Rosatom solutions, which they offer the world market?
Well, I think we'll see. It will depend on how much commitment and investment and interest there is in non-Russian countries to develop their own nuclear industries, including for export. There are alternatives to both Russian enrichment services and Russian fuel, as well as Russian nuclear reactor technology. There are non-Russian alternatives, and I would add non-Chinese alternatives as well. There are countries in Europe, the US, and Asia that can provide alternative supply for these. Whether they'll be able to compete with Russia is, perhaps a separate question. Russia offers quite attractive financing options to its customers for nuclear power plant construction, at least. Can other suppliers provide similar financing options? Again, they might not be willing to, or they might not be able to. But I do think that there is a really a compelling case to be made for the fact that there are alternatives. And I think, if we're looking at examples for that, I think Ukraine is an excellent example. This is a country that has historically had really significant dependence on Russia for its nuclear energy sector. And it has, over time and under very particular circumstances, of course, been able to switch completely away from Russian supply of fuel for Russian maintenance of its reactors, etc. So I think, if of all the lessons that I think we'll be able to learn from Ukraine, I think within the nuclear energy sector, really those and other countries really do need to be looking to Ukraine in terms of how do you move away from Russian dependence effectively and relatively quickly, really.
Well, and that is a very challenging question. How it is it possible to switch from a supplier, which is one of only four in the global market, and with whom you have strong ties, to other suppliers, even in the face of the threats which are coming from the Russian Federation, from its state-owned companies. It was Darya Dolzikova, who is a research fellow with Royal United Service Institute, Russia's Proliferation and Nuclear Policy program. She analyzes the role of Russia in global nuclear supply chain and also how Russia influences nuclear security in regards to Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and wait for the next interviews.